Hey everybody, Jeff Todd here for MLB Trade Rumors. I hate to do this to you Mets fans, but today we're going to go revisit, yes, last winter's Robinson Cano, Edwin Diaz blockbuster deal. And, I'm going to tell you why I think it was such a bad trade for the Mets. Is that opinion shocking? No, not at all. But the reason may be it really has very little to do with how poorly those players played in 2019. If you could first head down below, subscribe to our videos so that they will show up for you because we're doing them every day. We've got more exciting stuff to come, including the appearance, hopefully very soon, of MLBTR's founder, Tim Durkis. Hopefully we'll get to do some chats, talk about some things together, spice things up a bit, but let's get to it. The very first big move of the GM Brodie Van Wagenen era for the Mets. Now, this was one of those rare trades where the broad parameters leaked out early and pretty clearly. So we had a lot of advance notice, and Steve Adams, Tim, and myself, we chatted at length about this deal as it was developing and gave our opinions. And I gotta say, I think we all were very clear. We all came to a viewpoint about what would make sense here for the Mets, and when the deal actually was finalized, we were all a bit floored about what they gave up to get, admittedly, a historically good player in Robinson Cano and one of the game's best young relievers in Edwin Diaz, but the amount of salary they ended up taking on for the value they're getting back, and of course, that big-time prospect value that they gave up in Jared Kelenic, Justin Dunn, it just didn't really seem to add up. So let's go back and do the math on this deal. Look, value isn't everything all of the time, but it's an important starting point, especially when you're talking about a swap that came together early in the offseason when there were lots of other alternatives out there for the Mets. Cano was owed $120 million more on his contract. This is a guy who was nearing his late 30s, despite still being a heck of a player in the lead up to this deal. In spite of a PED suspension, that was obviously way more than he was worth, and everyone acknowledged that. But you start with that 120. You took out the contracts that were shipped to Seattle. Jay Bruce, Anthony Swarzak. Seattle also kicked in $20 million. Do the math. About $66 million in Cano money that the Mets were taking on. There's just no way that's what he would have earned in free agency. I think as we discussed it, we felt the max that he might have taken on the open market would have been maybe something like 50, low 50s on like a 3 or 4 year deal. And that would be assuming that teams were willing to pay up after that PED suspension. Maybe he would have signed a different contract, but that would have been on the open market. So the Mets were perhaps overpaying for Cano, for a guy that really, if you looked at their roster, it did not seem like they needed. That was really the value starting point for us when we were looking at this deal. Now, when you view Cano that way, you can start to see how it looks like the Mets really backed their way into this swap. The deal was obviously about Edwin Diaz from the Mets' perspective. They saw a hot young closer, really one of the best relievers in baseball in 2018. There's no denying that. But it seemed like the club maybe got some sort of tunnel vision, which is how Tim Durkis put it when we were debating this. And I think Steve Adams really hit the nail on the head. I went back and reviewed our emails on this before the trade was finalized. And as he put it, it seemed like the Mets really locked in on Diaz and just kind of backed into being forced to take on Cano in this deal because how much surplus value did Diaz really stand to have? Now, I was probably the high guy on our team on Diaz. I felt like he really had a ton of surplus value. He had been super elite. He was super young, didn't have a lot of wear and tear on the arm. And I felt like, he was a much better bet for any team that needed a high-end reliever than going onto the open market and spending big money on some guys that were certainly going to be older, have more wear and tear and all that. And as Steve rightly pointed out, though, this also was not a guy who had that sort of Craig Kimbrell track record, years and years of performance. So he wasn't a certainty, and maybe the Mets treated him like he was. if you just looked at the value proposition of Diaz himself, Steve felt like factoring in his potential arbitration salaries, he might be $30 to $35 million of surplus value. I was a little higher than that, up to something like $50 million of surplus value. But that alone is justified and more when you're looking at the prospects that were included in this deal. Because Jarred Kelenic is not just any old prospect. You're talking about a guy that had been the 6th overall draft pick as a high schooler and really hit kind of everything you'd want him to do, all those marks in his first season as a pro. And as we now know, after his second season, his first season with the Mariners, top 10 prospect in all of baseball. Maybe the Mets couldn't have quite foreseen that. Obviously, they were selling high on a young player. Or they thought they were selling high. But this was a guy that many prospect watchers at that time saw as having some serious potential to rise up, just like he has, to becoming one of the game's best prospects. Dunn, meanwhile, a near major league ready starter, potentially reliever, but a guy that obviously looks very likely to contribute value at the major league level, a very different kind of prospect, but also a significantly valuable player, and one that a team like the Mets could certainly have used in the near term. He's not the only higher level pitching prospect that they have ended up giving up, as it's turned out. They also parted with one in that Marcus Stroman trade, Anthony Kay. So they've given up some of those top levels of the farm type of guys. And in this deal, the value proposition, in our opinion, just was not quite there. It wasn't quite there. It was a win now move in the way that you worry about win now moves, because it created a window for the Mets of about 2 or 3 years. Remember, Diaz's value was tied up not only in his performance, but in his anticipated arbitration salaries. Saves pay huge money in arbitration, and so over time, the better he pitches, but also the more saves he picks up, the more he's going to earn in arbitration. So his most valuable years were at the early stage of that contract. As it turned out, he did get a fair number of saves. He also struggled badly in the results department in 2019. He's still getting $5.1 million in his first arbitration year, and so he's a guy that's still going to earn pretty good money, and if he pitches better, that earning will just shoot right back up. Meanwhile, the Mets also ended up taking on the Cano money. We know how poorly that went. Now listen, this deal is probably not going to work out for the Mets from a value perspective. It obviously looks a lot worse now than it did at the time. It could be a complete disaster, but there are still ways that the Mets can recoup value from it. The fact that we're dealing with a delayed season right now certainly does not help, because the Mariners side of the trade is not performing at the big league level in 2020 anyway. These are young guys. The Mets are losing important aspects of the control rights over those players as we speak. But over at MLB Trade Rumors, Connor Byrne, who's our newest full-time member of the staff, has just analyzed both Cano and Diaz as bounce-back candidates. Maybe some cause for hope there for Mets fans. Do go over and check those pieces out. Pop down below. Let me know your thoughts on this trade. I know everybody's got an opinion on this one. Hit the like button, and please do subscribe to keep up with all of our future videos.